Hello everyone, welcome back to AV Chess Lab. So what is wrong with Magnus Carlsen? In his last two events, he lost in the final of the Skilling Open to Wesley So. He then had his first loss ever in the Chess.com Rapid Chess event, where he lost to MVL. And today, at the Airthings Masters, he missed a simple tactic against Aronian that he probably sees 99 out of 100 times. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at this game, and we're starting right now. So in this game, we have Magnus Carlsen against Levon Aronian, which was played in round 1 of the Airthings Masters, which is the second event of the Champion Chess Tour. So the game started with these moves, and after bishop to b4, we have the Queen's Gambit decline, Rogozin defense variation. Magnus likes to deal with this by simply taking here, and then playing the bishop to f4 or bishop to g5. In this game, he chooses the bishop to f4 variation, which puts direct pressure on the pawn on c7. Ironian goes for c6, which has two purposes. It protects the pawn on d5 and also prepares to move the queen to b6 and a5. Magnus plays e3 in order to develop his bishop to this square, and Aronian prevents that by playing bishop to f5, which leaves the pawn on b7 unprotected. And Magnus takes advantage of that by challenging the bishop and the pawn with queen to b3. Now, if bishop takes c3, b takes c3, we still attack the pawn and we have the bishop pair. So Aronian doesn't want to do that. Instead, he goes for queen to b6, keeping the tension going. Here, Magnus decides to change gears. And okay, you protected your bishop on b4 and your pawn on b7, but what are you going to do about this bishop? Aronian plays bishop to g6. Notice that if he plays bishop e6 here, we simply go bishop d3 and we take the diagonal and we have a better game. So bishop to g6 is telling Carlsen, okay, you're going to have the bishop pair, but after we take, I'm going to have the open h file for my rook and attack you there in the future. Here Magnus plays h3, which prepares in some cases to, after we move the bishop out, to castle, and then this pawn will no longer be attacked by the rook, but also gives a square for this bishop to hide in case knight to h5 comes. So after h3, developing moves like knight b to d7, bishop to d3 occur in the game. And here, Aronian decides to change the whole character of the pawn structure, and he goes for c5, which is the best move in the position, taking advantage of the fact that this knight is still pinned. So we're not really threatening to take this pawn. Here Magnus continues with a3, and after bishop a5, the queens get exchanged, and we take on c5, knight takes c5, and both sides decide to castle. So what are some weaknesses in Black's position here? We have the pawn on d5, which is isolated, and isolated pawns most of the time are weak pawns, and we have double pawns on this side. And as you can see, the whole white structure is not that bad. We only have two pawn islands, and probably we have the better game at the moment. So from here, the game continues, king to b1, so that in some cases, this rook can come to the c file and attack the king that way. Knight to e6 is played, and here Aronian is trying to eliminate his weak pawn on d5 by playing to d4, and at the same time, we're attacking the bishop on f4. So Magnus decides to go for bishop to e5, preventing this move from happening at the moment. So if we were to play d4 now, this after knight to b5, notice now that we have 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking the pawn. And if this pawn takes here, we simply give this check, and after the king moves, we take here and we're going to win an exchange. So that's not possible. So instead, the game continued with bishop to c7. The bishops get exchanged, and still the same weaknesses are still on the board. Bishop to c2, putting more pressure on the pawn. g4. So now Aronian decides, okay, I can't really do anything with this weakness here. Notice that again, if d4 is played, we simply give the same check again, and we pick up this pawn or that pawn. So Aronian now decides to exchange the other weakness on the other side by playing g6, and he's trying to go g4 here. Here Magnus continues to put pressure on the pawn on d5. And here Aronian plays c6 and already begins a quest in which he starts going wrong, and eventually he's going to go down a pawn. Carlsen plays rook to c1 with the nasty threat of simply just taking the knight on d5 and winning the game on the spot. So Aronian has to move back into d6. And Magnus finally goes knight to b5, king moves, and he takes the pawn. So we're already up a pawn, or Magnus is up a pawn, and he should win this game considering he is the master of endgames. And after knight to e4, Magnus goes back to b5. So after knight to b5, Aronian plays g4. And why not knight takes on f2? If knight takes f2, we simply play rook here. If the knight goes back to e4, we take on f7, and we have a better game. But more importantly, if the knight goes to d3, then that loses the game on the spot to bishop to c2. And after knight takes here, we deliver checkmate on f5. So for that reason, Aronian decides to go for the move g4 instead. And here Magnus played rook to c2, somewhat throwing a little bit of his advantage away. A better move was to simply capture on g4. I noticed that if rook takes on h1, he had the intermediate f4, and I think this is the move that maybe he missed, because it makes no sense. Otherwise, he would go for this and he's just completely winning. The other move after Magnus takes here is not to take on h1, but to take this pawn again. But we simply, again, play rook to f1, and after he takes there, we take on f7, and again, we're going to have the better game. Notice that if we continue this variation for a few more moves, we're going to be up a pawn after rook takes g7, with the bishop against the knight, so this should be a pretty comfortable game for white to continue playing. So instead in the game, rook c2 is played, and after rook to h5, a few exchanges happen, and we get this position, in which it still looks like white is doing very, very nice. Knight to f5, putting pressure on this pawn, and Magnus protects it with rook to c3. Knight to e7, knight to c7, g5, and knight takes e6. And this is, I think, the last moment where something else could have been played. And I think from here on, Magnus completely throws away the advantage. He should have gone for e4, and after d takes e4, knight takes e6, rook takes d1, bishop takes on d1, king takes on e6, pawn takes on e4, white still up a pawn. He's going to have the bishop against the knights, and the pawn on b7 is probably going to drop as well. But instead, we get this position, and from here on, it's very hard for white to create any more threats. So a few more moves are played. Rook to c7, knight to f5, e4 now, knight to d4, attacking the bishop and the pawn. So rook takes b7, protecting the bishop. Rook takes on h3, pawn takes on d5, pawn takes, Magnus gives a check, and king to d6. He comes back, takes, and we get the position on the board. And let's just get to the blunder. After rook to d4, which is a complete disaster by Aronian, it was here that Magnus played automatically. He didn't even think. On the spot, like, rook d4 is played, and Magnus simply went rook takes d4, missing the winning line. So if you want to pause the video and figure out what the winning line is, this is your opportunity. Okay, if you found pawn to f4 check, taking the rook, my friends, you would have played better than Magnus today. Instead, Magnus took there, and the game just petered out into a draw. King versus king. And disappointment again for the world champion. Thanks for watching. Before we end this video, I want to say hello to everyone following from Brazil. If you're new to this channel, like and subscribe, and leave a comment down below. As always, stay safe, have a great day, and show respect to your opponent. See you next time.